The first news item from Al-Ahram Online that reads, President Sisi addresses UN Climate Summit in Paris. President Abdel Fattah Sisi addressed the opening session of the UN Climate Summit held in the French capital, Paris, inking an historic deal to stave off disastrous global warming. In his speech, the president called for reaching a binding agreement on the joint responsibility between developed and developing countries to alleviate the negative effects of climate change. President Sisi said that African countries were not responsible for the carbon emissions, yet they are among the worst affected. Meanwhile, Sisi called for uniting international efforts to create better life for the people. Presidential spokesman Ambassador Ala Youssef said that the president's participation is highly important as he is presiding the Presidential African Committee in charge of the climate change. Moving on to the daily news of Egypt that reads, Egypt Sisi meets French President defense ministers for bilateral talks in Paris today. The news item itself reads, President Abdel Fattah Sisi meets today his French counterpart François Hollande and the French Defense Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian in the bilateral talks in Paris. Sisi, who is heading a committee representing an African nations taking part in formulating a universal and legally binding UN agreement on climate change, met on Sunday with the representatives from Dassault Aviations, which build Rafale fighters, and the Mistral company specialized in manufacturing aircrafts. Egypt earlier this year signed the deal with France to buy 2 Mistral warships and has received Rafale fighter jets. Sisi held a number of talks on Sunday, including with Iraqi President Fuad Muassam. In a meeting with the UNESCO Director General Irina Bokova, Sisi praised the efforts exerted by the organization to bolster security measures of museums and archaeological sites. The Egyptian leader also lauded UNESCO's restoration work for archaeological sites that have been damaged by militant attacks. Moving on to the World Bulletin that reads, Fights with Climate Change, Terrorism Linked, Hollande. The news item itself reads, French President François Hollande said that the fights against terrorism and global warming are closely linked as world leaders meet in Paris for the climate change talks 2 weeks after deadly militant attacks in the French capital. Hollande also reiterated that any deal to try to keep any further rise in global temperatures down to 2 degrees centigrade needed to be universal, differentiated and binding, with richer countries contributing more than poor ones. He added that world peace is at stake in the talks. The next news item is from the Daily Star of Lebanon that reads, Israel suspends EU role in peace process with Palestinians. The news item itself reads, Israel said that it was suspending contact with the European Union bodies involved in peace efforts with Palestine after the bloc started requiring the labeling of exports from Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is also the foreign minister, ordered the ministry to carry out a reassessment of the involvement of EU bodies in everything that is connected with the diplomatic process with the Palestinians. An Israeli Foreign Ministry statement said that until completion of the reassessment, Prime Minister ordered a suspension of diplomatic contacts with the EU and its representatives in this matter. The next news item is from the World Bulletin that reads, Syria denies ever using chemical weapons in the civil war. The news item itself reads, Syria categorically denied using chemical weapons, including chlorine gas, in its 4-year civil war, telling a global watchdog it is cooperating fully with efforts to destroy its stockpiles. Deputy Foreign Minister Faisal Miqdad told the annual meeting of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Syria has never used chlorine or any other toxic chemicals during any incidents or any other operations in its territories since the beginning of the crisis and up to this very day. Earlier, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad said that his enemies abroad had increased support for the regime's armed opponents since the start of the major offensive to win back lost territory. The next item is from RT that reads, Iraq Prime Minister says country has sufficient forces to fight Daesh. The news item itself reads, Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi said that Iraq has sufficient forces to fight a Daesh group after American senators called for more U.S. troops to be deployed to the country. Abedi's remarks came a day after American Senator John McCain and Lindsey Graham advocated an increase of U.S. forces in Iraq to around 10,000 from the current cap of 3,550. McCain said that the Iraqi Prime Minister wanted more American presence in Baghdad. The next item is from the Gulf Today that reads, 3 Saudi soldiers killed in clashes on Yemen border. The news item itself reads, Saudi Interior Ministry said that 3 Saudi soldiers were killed in a clash with armed hostile elements who attempted to infiltrate the border from Yemen. The clash erupted on Sunday evening, hours after a Saudi border guard and 2 Yemeni civilians were killed in separate incidents in the border region, according to the ministry. In the latest incident, border guards in the southwestern Jazan district confronted an infiltration attempt by hostile elements who targeted military posts with gunfire and rockets, the ministry said. The infiltrators were forced to retreat, but 3 soldiers were killed in the clash. The ministry did not specify if the infiltrators belonged to the Iran-backed Shiite Houthi rebels who frequently clash with Saudi forces and bomb their border region. The next news item we have is from the World Bulletin that reads, Turkey sends body of dead Russian pilot to Moscow. The news item itself reads, Turkey today sent back to Russia the body of a pilot killed when his plane was shot down by the Turkish Air Force for allegedly violating its airspace in the Syrian border. A Russian plane carrying the body of Oleg Peshkov left Ankara's Esenboga International Airport for Russia. His body had at the weekend been taken from Syria to southern Turkey and then flown to Ankara. Both pilots aboard the Su-24 warplane ejected and parachuted to the ground on the Syrian side of the border after being shot down by Turkish F-16s in the November 24th incident. Peshkov was killed in circumstances that have yet to be fully explained, while the second pilot, Konstantin Morkatin, was rescued unharmed and had already spoken to Russian media. Prime Minister Ahmed Davutoglu had at the weekend announced the body had been handed over to Turkey from the Syrian side of the border as Ankara seeks to limit the damage from Russia's reaction. We're joined on the line right now by Mr. Abdul Latif Wahba, a journalist. Good afternoon, sir. Mr. Abdul Latif?
Aywa, yes.
Could you tell us a bit about what do you think of the Turkish action towards Russia and the fact that they handed over the Russian pilot's body today to the Russian authorities?
Yeah, of course. As you know, there was many escalations in the last days, especially after the strong Russian intervention in Syria. As you know, that the United States now is trying to take steps on the ground, especially after Obama administration was criticized completely in the Congress that they passed about maybe a year in Syria without achieving any goals. And at the same time, Obama also was criticized as the congressman, I think they said last week that the Syrian dilemma may be removed to the next or the coming president of the USA. And the U.S. administration's behavior in Syria now is working, as they said, to handle Syria to Russia and to Iran at the same time. As you know, also the Russian wasn't differentiate political groups in its war against ISIS or against the militia and the extremists in Syria. They are trying to face all the political or the religious groups and the sections in Syria just now. There is no differentiation between ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra or al-Jaysh al-Hur or any of these parties. And this is what gave the Russian administration a credibility in facing ISIS in Syria.
Do you think, sir, that Russia is going to go through with the economic sanctions that they said they would impose on Turkey by, you know, sort of removing Turkish investments in Russia and so forth?
Yeah. As you know that President Vladimir Putin took some procedures, economic procedures against the Turkish administrations, especially after they dropped their military air warplane in Syria. As you know that Putin asked the government first to stop and to postpone all the economic joint ventures with Turkey, and also asked the Russian tour operators not to deal just now with the Turkish market, as the Russian citizens may face some threats in Turkey at the same time.
Can we just take a look at the next news item as well, because it's related to what's happening between the Turks and the Russians. From the Moscow Times that reads, Turkey will not apologize for downing a Russian fighter jet, according to the Prime Minister. The news item talks about the Turkish Premier saying that Turkey will not apologize for downing a Russian fighter jet along the Syrian border, but urged Moscow to reconsider retaliatory sanctions in the hope of calming the crisis. Davutoglu told a joint press conference with the NATO heads, Jens Stoltenberg, after talks in Brussels, that protection of Turkey airspace border is not only a right but a duty for the government, and not Turkish Premier or President will apologize for doing so. It's clear that the Turks are very adamant about not wanting to apologize for this incident, but how do you think this is going to affect the Turkish-Russian relations?
As you know, that I think there is an international convention just now for the climate changes in France, and as you know that the Turkish president tried many times before to call Putin or to a time for a meeting in France, and Putin himself refused all these trials to discuss the problems between the two countries. But I think that Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, may in the coming day, maybe in coming days, declare some sort of apologize, especially after President Vladimir Putin refused also to meet him on the sidelines of the climate change conventions in France. Now, I think sometimes maybe the French president may be a dealer between the two administrations, especially France supported Russia in its war in Syria just now against Daesh and so on. I think now.
How do you see the relationship now between Turkey and Russia? There's a lot of talk of not just tension economically, but this could have major political consequences on the NATO members such as Turkey.
Yeah, of course. As you know that the Russian-Turkish relations is going to another ambiguous phase, especially as you know that the Russian President Putin wanted to express for his people that he will not leave the rights of his officers of the crew of the war plan and so on. I think maybe a confrontation politically in French climate conventions will happen, and at the same time as the confrontation is going on just now on the Syrian land, especially the close border, the Syrian close border with Turkey. As you know that the Russian now forces, I mean the Russian attacks are concentrated in on the borders with Turkey. This is, of course, to practice some pressures upon the Turkish administration.
Okay, Mr. Abdulatif Wahaba, a journalist, thank you so much for joining us on the line and giving us more depth into the Russian-Turkish crisis. Let's take a short break and then get back to it again.
Thank you.
Welcome back. Our final item is from The Guardian. It reads, the protest planned in London as Syria airstrike boats looms. The news item itself reads, thousands of people protested in London against Britain potentially joining airstrikes against Daesh in Syria. Parliament is expected to vote on the issue next week after Prime Minister David Cameron pushed MPs to back the move in the wake of this month's Paris attack. The protest is organized by the Stop the War Coalition protest movement, which is also holding a string of other demonstrations around Britain. Britain is already involved in airstrikes against Daesh in Iraq, but has not so far taken part in bombings of the group's positions in Syria. Well, this brings us to the end of this episode of The World Today, but stay tuned for more updates on Nile TV.